Greetings, everyone. I am Syed Ali Jafri, and I welcome you to another episode of the CSSPR webinar series, which aims to bring to you quality discussions on strategic foreign policy and security issues. Ever since the advent of nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Academy has grappled with questions related to their effects on state behavior, especially with reference to the use of force. Popularized by Robert Jervis and his fellow travelers, the theory of the nuclear revolution argues that the possession of secure, survivable nuclear capabilities creates mutual vulnerabilities, making military victories meaningless and crises infrequent. All this, the theory contends, attenuates security dilemmas and stabilizes nuclear relations. Although the theory is compelling, it has been critiqued by many a scholar, not least because states have behaved at odds with it. Doctor Mark S. Bell is one of the critics of the said theory. In his book entitled Nuclear Reactions: How Nuclear Armed States Behave, he introduces the theory of nuclear opportunism. This theory posits that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by states facilitates a range of foreign policy behaviors. What lies at the heart of this theory, however, is that this set of behaviors remains untenable without nuclear weapons. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has raised many a question on the role both the absence and presence of nuclear weapons played in that. That such inquiries are related to Dr. Bell's theory is reason enough to have a conversation with him, and today we are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Bell himself. A word about Dr. Bell. Doctor Mark Bell is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. His research examines issues relating to nuclear weapons and uh, proliferation, international relations theory, and US and British foreign policy. His above mentioned book examines how states change their foreign policies when they acquire nuclear weapons, and it was published in 2021 by Cornell University Press and won the International Studies Association Foreign Policy Analysis Section's Best Book Award. Other work has been published in journals including International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Conflict Resolution, um, Journal of Strategic Studies, Tax's National Security Review, the Washington Quarterly, and Defense Studies, and has been funded by organizations including the Stanton Foundation, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the Smith Richardson Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, and the Tobin Institute. Thank you so much, Dr. Bell, for joining us on this program. It has always been a pleasure to listen to your views and to read your excellent volume of work, especially your book that I just mentioned in my introduction. So that I mentioned your book in the introduction means it's it's good to start off with how you define and frame nuclear opportunism. And while people, for the benefit of our audience, it is important that we understand what is the critique about when it comes to the nuclear revolution theory. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so the way I at least think about the theory of the nuclear revolution, which, as you say, is this sort of very um, influential, very dominant theory, at least among academics, for thinking about the political effects that nuclear weapons have, is that there's really kind of two theories within the theory of the nuclear revolution. So one is a sort of observation about certain technological features of nuclear weapons, right? That they are extraordinarily powerful, right? But they pack that extraordinary explosive power in a very small physical device, right? So what that means is that you can put an extraordinary amount of destructive capability, the end of a missile. You can put them on submarines under the water. Um, and that in turn means that nuclear weapons are very easy to hide and they're very hard to defend against because it only takes one to get through and you've lost a major city. So the theory of the nuclear revolution takes these sort of technological properties that nuclear weapons have, and it sort of infers as a result that these are very powerful weapons of deterrence, essentially. That nuclear weapons are very good for guaranteeing a state's security because it's very easy for a state to retaliate with just one or two nuclear weapons, even in the context of, or even in the aftermath of a military defeat, right? So, and in that retaliation, you can generate extraordinary destruction for your adversary, right? So that's one sort of part of the theory of the nuclear revolution, right? Is a story about kind of the technological properties of these weapons and the reason that they grant states considerable security as a result. Then there's a second part of the theory of the nuclear revolution, which is sort of about the political consequences of that security for state behavior, right? And the theory of the nuclear revolution basically takes the view that um, once states become more secure, once they have nuclear weapons and are more secure as a result, they will therefore become sort of more benign in international politics, right? Their security will be guaranteed. They will therefore have less need for aggressive foreign policy behaviors. They'll have less need for alliances, um, and they'll basically be more relaxed, right, in the international system. So my theory of as you say, that I sort of refer to as theory of nuclear opportunism, more or less agrees with the first part of the theory of the nuclear revolution. I more or less agree with the diagnosis of these particular technological properties of nuclear weapons and the sort of first order effects that they have. Right. And that distinguishes me from some other critics of the theory of the nuclear revolution who challenge those technological the more technological part of the argument. Um, where I disagree with the theory of the nuclear revolution is how states respond to that security. Um, I have a view of how states behave in the international system, of sort of the origins of state preferences, that is a little more sort of aggressive, essentially. That states have desires in international politics beyond security. And therefore, when they acquire nuclear weapons, they don't just sort of bank that security. They actually go and try to achieve those things that they wanted to achieve before, beyond security. And that's why, in my view, nuclear weapons have these sort of facilitating effects that they enable states to pursue various behaviors, right? For precisely the reasons that the theory of the nuclear revolution identifies, technologically speaking, in terms of the properties that nuclear weapons have. It's just I think that the nature of state preferences is different to what the theory of the nuclear revolution says. And so that's sort of where the theory of nuclear opportunism comes from, and then it sort of says a bit more about, you know, what I think in more precise terms states will do, and that states in different geopolitical positions will try to achieve. But that's basically the sort of the structure of the theory and the way in which it relates to the theory of the nuclear revolution.
Thank you so much for laying this out so lucidly and eloquently. I think yes, the so everybody agrees with some of the hallmarks of nuclear weapons. They cannot be defended against. They do not. They're not good defensive weapons. They can't. You can't defend. You can't defend your country with nuclear weapons. They deter. That is why the construct has always been deterrence, not defense. Although people have written books like Snyder wrote Defense and Deterrence and Defense way back in the day. Uh, so this additional security, the nuclear revolutionaries think it will have a moderate effect. It will have an effect in the sense that it will attenuate the security dilemma. But you are of the opinion that this will facilitate a range of behaviors that were hitherto not available to states. Uh, those behaviors are well explained in the book, but to me, there's an overlap between certain behaviors. Like if you're aggressive, you can also be steadfast. And if you're trying to bolster an alliance, you can be aggressive. So there is this problem of overlapping between certain behaviors, but the overall point remains that yes, states will be able to do much more than they could have done without having nuclear weapons. But we also have this quite compelling construct of the stability instability paradox. How different the your overall theory is to that paradox that Snyder popularized in the 60s.
Yeah,
When
so
it
so
comes to crises, and I'm from that part of the world which has seen many a crisis since 1998 at least. So we have often heard this term stability instability paradox. I do not believe it applies to the South Asian context as it did to the Cold War context, but I would love to have your thoughts on that.
yeah, so stability instability paradox is always, I mean, it's a bit of a puzzling kind of thing. I mean, the way I think about the stability instability paradox is that it's sort of an addendum to the theory of the nuclear revolution in a certain way, right? It's a way for um, people who buy the theory of the nuclear revolution to say, well, but here's a way in which we might still get a whole bunch of conflict, right? Even if the theory of the nuclear revolution is true, maybe that just, by ruling out or making incredibly dangerous general strategic exchanges of nuclear weapons, all out war, that actually makes it safer to engage in lower levels of behavior, right? Lower levels of conflict. Um, so that's fine, I think. To me, what my theory does and is basically sort of a different way to get to the same outcome in certain ways, right? I mean, I agree you might see a, low level conflict. I agree you might see states doing all sorts of things in the um, under the nuclear umbrella. Um, but to me, my theory is sort of a more parsimonious, more straightforward way to get to that outcome than it is to say, well, here's the whole construct of the theory of the nuclear revolution, and then we add on this whole construct of the stability instability paradox. My view is just, well, nuclear weapons enable certain behaviors. And to me, that seems a more straightforward way of explaining why nuclear weapons seem to be associated with these particular behaviors, right? More broadly, the stability instability paradox only applies um, to relations between um, states that have a high degree of strategic stability, right? So it's not clear the extent to which the stability instability paradox can shed light on a whole bunch of the behaviors that I'm interested in explaining, right? Which is how do nuclear armed states relate to or behave towards non-nuclear states, right? I think my theory has something to say about that. The stability instability paradox doesn't really have anything to say about that. So I guess my view would be, the stability instability paradox is sort of this interesting intellectual addition to the theory of the nuclear revolution. Um, but it's sort of it's a weird one in the sense that it sort of reverses the conclusions you should draw from the theory of the nuclear revolution. And my view would be, well, why don't we just have a different theory that explains that directly?
And even otherwise, it's not a theory. The stability instability paradox is not a theory. It's kind of a concept that was thrown out, and it has been it is dubbed a powerful one. But I'm always uncomfortable with uh, throwing randomly throwing around Cold War concepts to explain other nuclear dyads. because that's something that reeks of intellectual laziness, in my considered opinion. Uh, but when it comes to nuclear opportunism, I do see a lot of merit in the sense that, like, states agree that there is a revolution, but states do want to eke out ways to evade that, the revolutionary effects of nuclear weapons. And that is, I think, that the effort to evade those revolutionary effects is what could generate is what opportunism is, uh, in my opinion, and based on my reading of your work. States are not comfortable with being stifled. They want to retain their freedoms of action. They want to have a better hold of both their allies and adversaries. And uh, taken together, you have quoted Francis Gavin in your recent article. He talks about, in one of his other works, he talks about the strategies of inhibition. Like, you, the US, for example, would want to have the same bandwidth it had with others in the past. So with nuclear weapons, you need to do a lot of, you have a lot of other advantages, um, which you bring to the table. But my comment here and a question here is that, so if nuclear weapons are facilitating a range of behaviors, um, for a possessor, it is doing the exact same for the other possessor which has nuclear weapons. So if I can be aggressive after getting nuclear weapons, my adversary who has nuclear weapons can also get aggressive. So that clash, how do you look at that clash of aggression and the steadfastness? Because
Yeah,
both countries will have opportunism.
yeah, it's complicated, right? I mean, I think the and the empirics become complicated as a result. And I think as a result, you see these sort of complicated patterns in which both um, sides, and particularly in nuclear dyads, where both sides have nuclear weapons, you end up seeing these very complicated patterns of kind of deterrence and enabling effects that nuclear weapons are having, right? If you look at, Ukraine today, right, and the way in which both Russia and the United States are sort of behaving in that conflict, right? I think you see examples both of the ways in which both sides' nuclear weapons are deterring each other, right? But also the ways in which both sides' nuclear weapons are enabling each other, right? And you see both of those happening simultaneously. And so I think, the empirics are complicated as a result. But to me, the appropriate response to that is to sort of acknowledge that complexity, try to kind of unpick it, try to disentangle it, rather than kind of deny its existence. Right? I think, nuclear weapons are, the most destructive weapons that humankind has invented. We should expect them, therefore, to have pretty complicated, significant political and military political effects as a result. And I think that's what we see. And to an extent, I think, my criticism of the theory of the nuclear revolution is that it massively oversimplifies the effects that nuclear weapons have, both in a general sense, but also in that I think you see much more, complicated patterns across different states, right? And this was one of my original frustrations with the sort of literature that led me to, write the PhD dissertation that ultimately became the book, was that when I looked at history and when I looked at things happening in the world and when I looked at, the range of possibilities that, people were talking about with respect to, for example, Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, um, it just seemed that there was a lot more variety going on here, right? This wasn't the case that nuclear weapons had this single effect on on the behavior of states that acquired them. And explaining that complexity was sort of it was one of the kind of core motivations that drove me to this project and drove me to kind of try to have a slightly more nuanced understanding of the different effects that these weapons have on the foreign policies of different countries.
Thank you for this explanation. I so states have a variety of aims vis-a-vis their opponents and allies as well. And I agree. So this oversimplification is a big problem. It's a theoretical problem. Um, with that, there's another thing that the literature misses. I think it has missed quite a lot. Is the leadership variable. So ultimately, human beings are the ones who make decisions. I know there's a lot of influx of emerging EDTs, but ultimately humans are making decisions. Um, do you think that this bevy of behaviors that you have laid out in your book, do you think these could change as a result of the changing preferences of leaders? Because there could be a leader who could be enamored of this additional security. There could be a leader who could feel that nuclear weapons could be doubly dangerous, so we should not resort to any kinds and types of aggression. So, how do you look at the leadership variable when it comes to your theory and future
Yeah,
scholars?
so leaders are not in my theory. Um, and that's not because I think leaders are unimportant. Quite the opposite. I think they are important and they are important in various ways. Um, but any theory is sort of a simplified version of reality, right? And so any theory um, in providing a sort of map that tries to help us understand the sort of almost infinite complexity of the real world has to leave out all sorts of different things, right? And so one of the things my theory leaves out is leaders, right? And um, and that's a right. I think my theory could explain more if you included leaders, right? One of the cases that I think my theory basically gets wrong um, for a lot of its history is China and the way in which China has thought about its nuclear weapons. And I think there's very good evidence that a lot of um, the way in which China has thought about its nuclear weapons and their political utility, at least until more recent times, is that it was heavily influenced by Mao and his particular ideas about nuclear weapons, right? So there's an example um, where a state's leader and the particular views that that leader has, the particular ideas that leader has, may have played a pretty decisive role in the effects that nuclear weapons had on the state's foreign policy. And that's a case that my theory gets wrong as a result, right? But overall, I think, the goal of any theory, right, is to kind of try to balance these competing goals of um, parsimony, right, saying something in a sort of simple way, in an easily understandable way, a theory that doesn't have too many moving parts, versus the sort of explanatory richness that you get from just adding more and more factors into your theory. And so to me, um, leaders did not seem to add enough or in order to justify including it, right? It would have helped me explain the Chinese case. And I sort of fully acknowledge that. And I think, and maybe there are other cases that it would also have helped explain. I think it's a big part of the story of South Africa giving up nuclear weapons, for example, F.W. de Klerk and, in particular. Um, but overall, what I try to do in my theory is have a theory that can explain as much as possible of the sort of variation that I was trying to explain, in with as few factors as possible, right? And trying to strike the balance between that is sort of what theorizing is. And so leaders end up being one of the factors that ends up not being in the model, right? But again, it's not because I don't think it ever matters. It's not because I think it's generally unimportant. It's just that it wasn't one of the top few variables that I felt could tell a sort of coherent story about this phenomenon in general.
I think that's parsimony is something that all social scientists resort to, and you have to do it. Otherwise, sky is the limit. You can add as many variables as you want, but then your book would have been a 5,000 page book. So that's not how it works. I think you talked about the political relevance of nuclear weapons for modern day China. In my previous podcast, I had Dr. Tong Zhao on to discuss exactly this, and we have, the United States has grappled with this problem of arms control and China's reticence or refusal to join arms control negotiations, and perhaps the reason as to why the US is not getting a hang of what the Chinese are thinking is this. China really has a great political value attached to nuclear weapons. This is what the at least Xi's China is thinking. Like they're not modernizing their nuclear forces because of technical factors or improvements on the US side. They are more interested in seeing nuclear weapons as a political counterweight to a hegemonic West, and and they believe that nuclear weapons will come in handy when they sit on the negotiating table. So yes, strategic culture, leadership, history, all these things really matter, but there's only so much that we can do. Uh, Now moving on to the Russo-Ukraine war, you recently wrote a piece, an article for Japan on the political effects, the effects of nuclear weapons, or the role that nuclear weapons played or continue to play in the conflict. So my first question pertaining to that is, at the very outset of your article, you acknowledge both a lack of humility when it comes to talking about nuclear weapons, and also the continuing uncertainty related to nuclear weapons. So we see a lot of people definitively talk about the effect on nuclear weapons of the war in Ukraine, but you sound quite circumspect in making that assessment. Why is that the case? You do talk about you. I think you perfectly mention Gavin's framing that it's difficult to write about something that has not happened, and we know less about the actual what actually happened or what actually
Yeah,
is
I mean, I
happening.
think my position on this certainly draws heavily on Frank's work, but also others. I think there are real limits to what we know about the nuclear era in general, right? And that's for a few reasons. We um, Many of the most important episodes of the nuclear era are still shrouded in a lot of historical ambiguity. There's a lot of documents that remain classified. There's a lot of people who, did not and do not want to be interviewed about key events. There's an awful lot of secrecy that states retain about their nuclear arsenals and the way in which they've thought about their nuclear arsenals. Um, and and that's combined with the fact that nuclear weapons are these, they're not directly used very often. They sort of operate kind of in the background of international politics. Threats to use them are rarely made explicit. And so as social scientists, there's just a lot of uncertainty in kind of what we can hope to know about nuclear weapons, right? This is just a subject that is hard to study, or at least hard to come to conclusions about that don't have big kind of, in quantitative terms, big confidence intervals around them, right? And so therefore we should be, right? We should, as I kind of argued in that piece, we should have a fair amount of humility and be pretty cautious in the inferences we're drawing, especially about conflicts that are still very much ongoing, right? Um, and so that was sort of, in some part, the motivation for me writing that piece was that I was sort of frustrated that, a lot of people writing about nuclear weapons in Ukraine seem to be very sure that nuclear weapons were not having particular effects, right? Or very confident that nuclear deterrence was not working in Ukraine, or that nuclear weapons, were not something that the United States should take seriously in thinking about, um, the types of aid to give to Ukraine and so on. And we're effectively arguing that, that we should sort of pretty significantly rethink our kind of basic understandings of nuclear weapons from what was happening in Ukraine. And that's struck me as um, um, very intellectually overconfident, and more than the evidence um, kind of would support. And to me, when I look at what's happening in Ukraine, yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but broadly speaking, right, I think what we see in Ukraine is very similar to, or seems consistent with, these kind of very basic lessons about nuclear weapons that we as scholars have sort of settled on, right? That they deter certain behaviors, that they enable certain behaviors. Um, and to me, you're seeing these kind of complicated patterns of deterrence and enabling that I talked about before, um, in a way that strikes me as broadly consistent with the understanding of nuclear weapons that we've sort of developed over the decades. So to me, at least, it didn't strike me that Ukraine should be leading us to fundamentally rethink, how we think nuclear deterrence works, or the limits of nuclear deterrence, and so on.
Thank you so much for this. I think there is this temptation of calling every provocation under the sun as a failure of deterrence. Rudy decades ago warned us not to do this. This is not how things work. Yes, and I think you mentioned you really uh, mentioned this in your article that deterrence is working at certain levels. There has been no escalation between the U.S. and um, Russia, and you quoted one of the Ukrainian officials who said, "We have crossed many red lines, yet nuclear weapons haven't been used." So deterrence is working at certain levels, and here you're talking. If I correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about deterrence between the U.S. and the Russians. That deterrence is working, and obviously on the other hand, nuclear weapons are also giving Russia that cushion to
Mhm.
carry out its acts of aggression against the Ukrainians, and same goes for the U.S. Uh, but there is this. So Mariana Buchanan wrote a fantastic book on why Ukraine gave up its nuclear bomb, and at the end she talked about this growing concern within Ukraine about the relevancy of negative security assurances, especially the Budapest Memorandum. And she mentioned this term: the demand for deterrence has increased. So this I think aligns with your argument, which centers on telling readers that deterrence is working and nuclear weapons do have a deterrent effect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to me, I mean, um, to me, when I look at what's happening um, um, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I mean, I see the effects of nuclear weapons, or at least plausible effects of nuclear weapons that are very much consistent with deterrence, right? The United States, I think, would, if it would not for Russia's nuclear weapons, be far more involved in Ukraine. It would be providing far more capabilities to Ukraine. Equally, if there were no NATO nuclear weapons, no US nuclear weapons, I think it's very plausible that Russia might have, for example, attacked, um, shipments of weapons that are coming in from NATO allies, right? Which are all, it's very clear where they are. It's very clear that Russia has the military capabilities to attack them before they, cross into Ukraine. It's very clear that that would be militarily advantageous for Russia to do, but they're not doing it. And why not? Well, it seems to me that nuclear weapons are a sort of plausible explanation for that. Simultaneously, though, you're seeing these enabling effects, right? The United States is able to, send Joe Biden, right, to walk around in Kiev, right? Well, sending a US president to walk around in an open conflict zone, right? And to inform the Russians beforehand that you're going to do that, right? Because to do that, right, makes Joe Biden safer, not less safe, right? Well, that's this sort of very, in some sense, that's a very strange dynamic. Well, why is it a strange dynamic? Well, it's not a strange dynamic. Why? Because nuclear weapons have this kind of enabling effect, right? They enable states to take actions that would otherwise be kind of risky, right? Sending your president to walk around in an open conflict zone, right? Um, Similarly, Russia is able to have engaged in this incredibly sort of ruinous war, right? That has seen, you know, huge numbers of its armed forces decimated, right? That in theory should massively reduce its ability to defend its own core territory, right? Well, why is it able to do that? Well, because it can rely on its nuclear weapons to defend that core territory, right? And deterrence to defend that core territory. So, to me, I think you see these, and again, it's not this simple story purely about deterrence, but it's this kind of complicated patterns of both deterrence and enabling effects that these weapons have on the states that possess them.
I think same goes for the allowance to use long-range weapons. The fact that the US has allowed Joe Biden in his last month allowed Ukraine to use long-range weapons against Russia, that also speaks to this understanding that okay, there is that big weapon on top of us which will at a certain point or at a certain level uh, outlaw further escalation. So that uh, although I do not think existential deterrence is the only thing that matters, it is powerful. It really is powerful. If both states, if two warring parties choreograph their actions while taking into account the presence of nuclear weapons, I think that is a factor that we cannot ignore. Um, Another question that relates to your article is that I'm always frustrated with this idea of nuclear risk reduction due to one reason. You cannot engender deterrence without risks. If you take out risks from nukes, then the deterrent effect is no longer mm, is no longer valid. So this idea of nuclear risk reduction, like the last point of your article, delves into that quite remarkably well, in the sense that all of these enabling and deterrent effects are stemming from uncertainty and risk. So when we know that risks are an important part of generating deterrence, how do you look at this construct of nuclear risk reduction that is thrown around everywhere, especially in the NPT review process? I believe risk reduction is a ploy that nuclear weapon states within the NPT used to delay implementation of Article 6, because there is no deterrence without risks. This is my considered opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am pretty sympathetic to that argument. I mean, I think, and this actually gets back to your previous point you were making about China, right? Yeah, US officials are very frustrated that China will not engage in um, arms control talks, in sort of risk reduction efforts, right? Well, why is it that China would not want to do that? It's because China, as the um, uh, you know, China wants a potential crisis with the United States and potentially a crisis over Taiwan with the United States to be highly dangerous, right? They want it to be highly risky because they think that will deter the United States from intervening in it, right? So, and to some extent, this gets back to the theory of nuclear opportunism, right? Which is that I think, the theory of the nuclear revolution, but also ideas about sort of risk reduction have this kind of somewhat apolitical flavor to them, right? This sort of idea that nuclear risks are just this sort of thing that can be managed away, right? Or can be dealt with in this sort of technocratic fashion and reduced, um, while still having these kind of deterrent or enabling effects, right? My argument is that the way in which states think about their nuclear weapons is much more political than this, right? And it's much more um, and states in many cases have an interest, a political interest in increasing risk, right? If you ask why, so yeah, well, ask why China doesn't want to engage in risk reduction efforts. It's because they want that risk, right? Because that risk is for them and their political goals crucial for potentially deterring the United States, right? Same with North Korea, right? Um, and same, by the way, with for the United States during the Cold War, trying to deter a Soviet invasion of Europe, right? The United States adopted a very, escalatory nuclear posture for most of the Cold War, right? Was not interested in what we would today call risk reduction efforts, right? Why? Because they wanted the situation to be highly escalatory, because they thought that was the best way to deter a political threat that they were concerned about. So yeah, I think sometimes there are things you can do in a sort of risk reduction framework that kind of make sense that are sort of in everyone's interest, but there's a fundamentally sort of political limit to the effect they have, and that political limit stems from the fact that in most adversarial relationships, there's one side that is going to find that risk advantageous, and then there's another side that is going to find that risk disadvantageous. And the side that finds that risk disadvantageous, right, is going to call for risk reduction, right, and understandably so, right, and but it's not then surprising that the other side, which benefits from those risks, right, that can use those risks to its political advantage potentially, um, is going to be resistant to those efforts. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. That seems to me a fairly straightforward consequence of this more like political understanding of nuclear weapons.
Yes, let me be very frank here. Your theory is quite disturbing, or it's quite disturbing for people who are committed to non-proliferation. Because if somebody's reading your book, um, they could say, "Oh, the possession of nuclear weapons can facilitate these kinds and types of behaviors. So why not?" I recently wrote a piece for the Lobby Institute on why South Korea might go nuclear under Trump 2.0. And I believe if I were a South Korean um, who is constantly under mm, a threat from Kim Jong Un, I would definitely take some lessons from the book. I would say, okay, if I become a nuclear weapon state or a nuclear armed state, I could become more steadfast, I could become more aggressive, I could resort to revisionism. Perhaps that was why the North Koreans decided to go to go nuclear. Uh, Ever since going nuclear, Kim has been able to do what he couldn't have hoped to do before. So I think North Korea is a great exemplar of the strength of your theory. But if we were to extrapolate this to South Korea, I think the non-proliferation ayatollahs won't be happy.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's right. I mean, I'm hesitant to, I don't think, in general, I don't think we should sort of overestimate the effect that political scientists have. I think states are
Right.
perfectly capable and have proven themselves to be perfectly capable of figuring this stuff out themselves without the need for my for my book. But yeah, I mean, you're right that my book is in large part making an argument that these weapons are have political effects that many states find useful. Right. Now, it's not to say there are no costs associated with acquiring nuclear weapons. There are many costs associated with acquiring nuclear weapons, and that's part of the reason why so very few countries have chosen at this point in time, at least, to acquire nuclear weapons. Right. But it strikes me that it's sort of we shouldn't be in denial about the fact that these weapons do provide political benefits for the states that provide them. And indeed, the fact, going back to the point you made about non-proliferation, right, and the United States, it's precisely because the United States is very much aware of the political benefit that states get from having nuclear weapons that the United States has tried so hard to stop countries acquiring them, right? The United States does not want, for the most part, its allies to behave more independently from it. It does not want its adversaries to behave more aggressively, right? And so for the United States, by far the most powerful country in the world, right? The United States has a strong incentive in stopping other countries from getting these kind of political benefits, and that's so the motivation for what Frank has called the strategies of inhibition, but other scholars have talked about as well. Um, is to some extent the political benefit that states can get from nuclear weapons is precisely why the United States has been so motivated by that political goal.
Exactly, and I think uh, for that to happen, extended deterrence and negative security assurances need to be focused on. Otherwise, both currently, when we talk about the global nuclear order, extended deterrence is being weakened, or rather, the credibility of extended deterrence is being weakened. NSAs after the Ukraine war uh, have been dealt a severe blow. So these two things are really rupturing whatever whatever kind of nuclear order we had, at least after the end of the Cold War. So my absolute last question to you is: so you have done a lot of work on decoding crises and coding crises. So we now have the proliferation of EDTs everywhere. Emerging technologies, disruptive technologies are and will have a great effect on the hierarchies of escalation. I'm reminded of a piece by Rebecca Hurstman. She framed this idea of wormhole escalation. Like with gray zone tactics, you can achieve strategic effects, and you those effects cannot be deterred through nuclear weapons, and our understandings of strategic stability and deterrent stability fall short in expelling that. So if we were to actually believe that nuclear weapons have greater political benefits, how do you think dynamics within crises, especially taking into account the advent of EDTs, how will those dynamics shape up, and how would that affect strategic stability in any region?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to sort of think here in a kind of nuanced way, right? I think different emerging technologies are going to have different effects, and they may have different effects in different political contexts. Um, I'll just give one example of a set of technologies that I think is potentially very concerning from the respect of sort of crisis stability, um, and that's cyber capabilities, right? Part of the one sort of feature that cyber capabilities have, right, is that you generally don't want to reveal them in advance, right? If the United States, for example, is able to stop North Korea from launching missiles, right, because it has some sort of access to a, bug in the code or whatever that allows it access to and could prevent North Korea from doing that, right? Well, you can't reveal that, right? Because then North Korea could correct the code. They could, um, so you potentially have these dynamics where potentially you have states that are able to undermine each other's second strike capabilities, but they may not know that, right? And the capabilities they actually have may be less important than what either side fears the other side is capable of doing, right? And so I think you potentially have these very kind of dangerous dynamics whereby um, there are stronger incentives to escalate within crises, right? Now, the positive side of that, I guess, if there is a positive side, is that in theory should make states more hesitant to enter into those crises, right? So this again, there's sort of this political dynamic to all of this that you have to sort of think about. Well, if if we sort of have reason to believe that certain sets of crises are much more dangerous as a result of particular um, emerging technologies, whatever they are, well, maybe that actually has all of these political effects of nuclear weapons emerge from risk, right? And so if the risk is higher, right, states should be at least more cautious about entering into those crises, right? So it's not clear that all of these have an overall a negative effect, but once you're in a crisis, it certainly seems that at least some set of emerging technologies potentially make those crises more liable to escalate.
I think you've made a very good point at the end, that all this is risky is reason enough for us to figure out ways to avoid crises. And my director, Dr. Rabi Akhtar, has been talking about this, the de-escalatory side of emerging tech, and she last month wrote a Washington Quarterly article on this, on EDTs and how EDTs could, we should see EDTs as a way to cause de-escalation. Uh, and I'm also reminded of a recent article that Stephen Herzog did, which really makes a good point in that it says that EDTs have not reduced the fog of war. If anything, they have increased the fog of war. And with fog of war getting thicker, the likelihood of crisis management um, is becoming less. These are difficult times. Nuclear risks are increasing by the day. Um, the great power competition is back and with a vengeance. And unfortunately, the use of force as an instrument of trade policy is also back with a vengeance. So all three taken together don't bode well as far as I'm concerned. But if I were to extract one thing from your article, it is that all of this is a continuation of the past. Nothing new has happened that should give us sleepless nights. We should be worried even otherwise, but Ukraine has not fundamentally, or it should not fundamentally change our core beliefs about nuclear weapons. So thank you so much, Dr. Bell, for joining me on the program. It was an absolute pleasure to discuss threadbare your theory. I look forward to having more discussions with you in the future. Unfortunately, we will have a lot of bad reasons to talk about these issues because the world is not likely to be a peaceful one anytime soon. On this
Well,
somber note,
thank you
I
for having me. Yeah,
like to say thank you once again.
thank you.
Thank you.